Thanks for joining our program here today. We're going to have some awesome conversation, I think. Kind of first and foremost, let's dive in and meet our panelists here, Alex, Dave, and Mack. Alex, why don't you take it away and give a little introduction of yourself?
Happy to. Thank you for having me. Excited to be here. My name is Alex Angeline. So I started my background in architecture, working abroad in Switzerland primarily. Went from architecture to really wanting to get more involved in the startup scene and disruptive tech. So joined Notel in its early stage in London. And then now recently moving back to New York to build a real estate team here at Gorillas. So I'm very excited for the chat today.
Cool. Dave, where do you hail from, and give us your background and career path?
Good morning from the West Coast. So I live in the Bay Area. I work for Pinterest, which is San Francisco based. I'm the head of global workplace. And I've spent pretty much all my career in corporate real estate on the occupier side. Started with GLL, assigned to corporate tech clients, started all the way as a entry-level facilities coordinator, and expanded my scope over the years. And so about halfway through my career, switched over to the owner side, and I've been doing that ever since. So happy to be here, and thanks for the invitation.
Awesome. Mack, old friend, give us your bio.
Thanks, Matt. Hey everyone, I'm Mack Freedman. DraftKings is head of real estate. I've been at DraftKings for just over 6.5 years, and seen us grown from about 125 people to 3,500 people across North America and EMEA. So at DraftKings, I oversee all of our leasing, design, construction. I also manage our workplace experience and facilities teams across the world. Before that, I was briefly at Tishman Speyer and studied undergrad at BU, and I've been in Boston for better or worse my whole life. And I've been lucky enough to be working with people like Matt. Matt and I met back in, I think, 2015, and it's been great collaborating with him since. So excited to share some insight today.
Cool, thanks guys. So just to kind of set the baseline here of what kind of our discussion will be about, we're going to touch on how technology can help accelerate the project transaction and project delivery. I think the three companies that are represented here, could all be categorized as high growth companies, high tech companies, but they all have their unique needs, and that might impact real estate strategy specifically around transactions and project delivery. And just to underpin all of that, like where my background comes from is in the corporate transaction management space, kind of seeing firsthand a little bit how clunky that process can be, how hard it is to wrangle a lot of stakeholders across several different disciplines to execute on that transaction strategy, which is quite frankly why we founded Occupier, to become kind of that system of record for doing your deals, collaborating with your brokers and all your other stakeholders, and then managing your real estate obligations going forward. So our three panelists here can kind of chime in on the unique needs of their business. Maybe we can start with Alex here. Tell us a little bit about Gorillas, like what your guys' mandate is, your mission, and how that unique business model might impact how you guys think about real estate, specifically around growth.
Yeah. So Gorillas is a quick commerce platform which really aims to bring groceries and other goods to people in an unprecedented speed, and that is primarily done by essentially acquiring space in communities and putting these fulfillment centers as close as possible to density. I think the unique component of our real estate, it's multifaceted. So we're building a last mile logistics network, right? And we're taking the supply chain of traditional retailers and fragmenting that and building these nodes across cities in these dense neighborhoods. And that requires an approach to real estate that is slightly different than traditional retail. One being we need to have some sort of a distribution center, a large core place where we can procure and store our goods. And the second piece of that is these MFCs. So they need to be as close as possible to our core neighborhoods. They don't need to be in the traditional high street fashion where the foot traffic is important. They can actually be in, let's say, less obvious spaces. So we can be more creative around how we position our distribution network on the local level. I think generally speaking, the key piece, the way I see our real estate strategy really is kind of a three-pronged approach, where at the foundational level, we have to have a software that is really feeding us data to make decisions around these neighborhoods. That is critical to understand the types of products that we need to be having in our assortment. And it'll really help us understand the long-term profitability of some of these warehouses. So that kind of foundational layer really stems from overlap with our data science team and being able to look at these regions on a very local level, understand who is living in these neighborhoods and how to serve them best. The second piece is really how do we manage the existing real estate pipeline process? So we have a CRM software which helps us keep track of the pipeline because our growth is quite exponential at the moment. We have to really have structure to our requirements per region and per state. So a CRM process has been critical in this in-between state. And the third is our lease administration. Matt, you mentioned a source of truth. I think I'm not going to say that we don't. We use Occupier, and it's been incredible as a source of truth to keep our real estate team lean and generally allow us to have one place to look at all of our liabilities in one very streamlined environment. So those kind of three levels is how we accomplish the scale that we're seeing today, Gorillas.
Well, when you talk about growth, what is the scale that you're trying to get to, at least just in the U.S. because you are a European company? I mean, if you're trying to place goods in people's doorsteps in 15 minutes, you're going to have a massive real estate portfolio from a location count perspective. Is that correct?
Yeah, I think we're looking at this creatively. I think the way we've started to play this out in New York is we've put we followed the density, right? So where the most people are is where we've put our warehouses. So you'll find us in Manhattan, you'll find us in Brooklyn. I think we are exploring alternative ways of delivering. So, things like maybe our fleet itself is diversified. So we have e-bikes today, maybe tomorrow there's, a different type of mode of getting these goods farther. So I think in general, the real estate will be flexible and it will challenge us to be more creative with how we put deals together with owners and operators. I think that's a big push for us going forward.
Cool. Switching gears, Dave. I mean, Pinterest is kind of a household name at this point. You guys are a well-established company, but I'm sure also on kind of the cutting edge of how people occupy space and how you create a workplace for people. Tell us a little bit about kind of the current business drivers at Pinterest, how you guys are thinking about applying real estate strategies around transactions and growth based on those kind of high-level business goals.
Certainly, and I think like a lot of companies pre-COVID, I think we had it pretty well figured out. Our spaces were recognized as being extremely forward-facing, amenity-rich, very well-reviewed, and that was working. And on the growth curve that we had, get a few more employees, open more space, build it out to our standard, and that was the strategy pre-COVID. Now everything has changed. I mean, that's not news to everyone on this call, but we have additional variables that have come into play that we never had to consider before as corporate real estate executives. So attendance, occupancy, the geography of where people live has completely impacted how we think about sizing and programming real estate. And so that's just from the sizing and location perspective. And then you have sort of the built environment. What does that actually need to provide to employees? And the truth of the matter is, we don't know much about that yet. I'd love to say that we have it figured out. But the reality is, one, we don't know when this is all said and done, where people are going to be on the map. Are they going to return all to where they were pre-COVID? Absolutely not. We know that people have scattered and some of them have moved away for good. And how do we deal with that as a company? So again, both the distribution of real estate, how much we need, but also how do we build? So the traditional office of workstations and conference rooms and amenity space, that mix is probably not the right mix anymore. And so we're spending a lot of time thinking about like what that could be. We have a couple of office projects in flight where we're trying some things out and doing some things really differently from how we built offices before. But the reality is we don't know yet. And so we're really trying to preserve our optionality. And technology plays a key role in that in terms of, so what's ended up happening is our lease portfolio has really become a portfolio of many short-term leases. And while that gives us flexibility and we're not stuck with decisions for long periods of time in most cases, it means there's a lot of churn, a lot of activity, and the potential for missing a critical date or messing something up is extremely high when you have this constant churn of normal transactional activity. So the technology really helps us make sure that we stay on top of that, that we're monitoring and we're not missing things.
Yeah. Would you say that, I know you're a San Francisco-based company, would that kind of mobility of employees ring true across all of your global locations, or are you seeing a more kind of heavily weighted around the headquarters?
So we were a very headquarters dominant company pre-COVID, and that was an issue of itself. Is like, okay, how distributed do we really want to be long term? So definitely in the Bay Area, we've seen a lot of distribution of people going to lower cost locations. So I'd say that trend is probably true in the US. And so we've made moves to make sure that we have legal entities and we can pay people in all the states. So in the US, and I think to a large extent Canada, I would say that's true. I don't know that it's as prevalent in our European locations. I think there's more restrictions on where people need to live and work. And so it's a bit more complicated from a tax perspective. So I think the sort of the macro trends are global trends, but we're seeing it really applied very strongly in the US, if that makes sense.
Yep, totally makes sense. Mack, I would imagine a lot of that stuff rings true for you. I mean, if anyone's visiting Boston anytime soon, you guys should stop by the DraftKings headquarters. Mack was integral in building out an awesome space for their people that really kind of matches their brand and quite frankly provides a pretty awesome employee experience. But then COVID hit, right? So, you know, from a headquarters perspective, I would imagine you're experiencing a lot of the stuff Dave is, but maybe talk a little bit about kind of that hyper growth trajectory that DraftKings has been on and what some of the considerations are for you guys and how you think about your real estate strategy.
Yeah, I think what you just said, Matt, is really accurate. And David, as you went through kind of the description of what the space meant to Pinterest before COVID versus what it has been now versus what you see it in the future, that echoes very true and rings home to me as well. It's very similar, right? I think a lot of people here understand that working quote unquote real estate on the occupier side, if you're in a tech company like a Pinterest, like a DraftKings, it's not as much of a, every day you're going out and trying to get a lease done kind of role. It's much more of managing a team, creating a real workplace experience, and realizing that, we are a service org to the company as itself, but at the same time, we have an opportunity to really impact the way that people work and frankly experience the company. So, as we look at, kind of everything you just mentioned, Matt, I look back to like 2015 when I first started, and our real estate strategy and approach has always been much more of a corporate development feel and kind of path than it is I would say, acquisition, get as much space as we can kind of strategy. I look at a company, and this is more specific to Boston, but like Wayfair, which I believe is the biggest employer in Massachusetts. They have, I think, over 10,000 people. And, their strategy has always been take as much space as we can, build out what we need to. We have more if we need to, but then we can always sublease it. And I think, right before COVID hit, they were at a point where they had almost 350,000 square feet of vacant space in Boston. And, that's been a little bit of a struggle for them, obviously, since COVID has happened. Our approach at DraftKings has always been the opposite. Because we are not a real estate company, because we are trying to focus our money into acquisition of customers and growing the business and trying to gain our foothold in an emerging market, we've been in pretty much constant construction, Matt, as you know, for about 7 years straight, where we kind of bite off the minimum chunk that we can and we go. And that worked to an extent, but as hypergrowth goes, once you go from that like 300 to 500 person range to multiple thousands of people, you're dealing with too much space and too many moving parts to operate in that capacity. To David's point also, I don't know what the exact number is, but I would say it's at least half of our population was not working at DraftKings before COVID started and they'd never seen office spaces. The problem though is that, when you're hesitant to lease space and you're trying to be cost efficient with all this, what that results in is we were at a point where we were starting to move towards a lot more short-term leases as we tried to figure out what's the right amount of space to take. We were actually going to have a meeting with one of our founders the week that COVID hit. It was the week of March 6th, to tell him that we had to move half of his org to a temporary space across the city because we weren't done building out expansion space yet. It's impossible to keep up. And while COVID has really changed how we're thinking about using our space, how we think about, okay, maybe it's not so much creating space to make people stay in the office longer and provide amenities to keep them there, but it's more, how can we provide an on-site experience? That's also caused us to really take a step back and ask our employees questions, survey them, gather data to figure out what do they want. Because as anyone in my role can tell you, while it's not pertaining to my job exactly, the talent grab in our tech world is nuts right now. And if you're going to be a company that's going to quote unquote force people back 5 days a week, probably not going to end up too well for you. So, while we try to figure out how we can best use our space, we are also trying to, frankly, use technology and think more analytically about what do we do with our space. Some of that is figuring out our new seating ratio, figuring out what makes sense, figure out what other companies are doing. But it's difficult, right? And I'm interested to see how, Alex's opinions on this and what he's using differ, because his role is obviously in his company very different than like what a DraftKings is doing. But, one thing that I think rings true for everyone here is we're operating in the unknown. And it's this tough line to balance of follow the industry standard to feel like you're kind of doing what everyone else is doing versus doing what you think actually might make the best impact. And that's why, I'm trying to frankly participate in panels like this, meet more people and understand what other people are doing, because there is no right answer right now. Sorry for the rant.
Well, it sounds like you've certainly been thinking about this a lot, and it's permeating your day to day, which is awesome. I think let's take a pause here for a second, because we're going to release our first polling question, and we'll give everybody a couple of minutes to answer, and then we'll kick off into the next gear. Specifically, this question is around: have you implemented a technology strategy around kind of your transaction management, your project delivery? All right, cool. Well, people are answering that. Oh, here we go. We're about 50-50. All right, and I would imagine a lot of those answers are dependent on factors that are unique to your business as well. So whether you're managing a huge pipeline like Alex, you're probably more interested in trying to rein that in with technology. But if you're kind of a single headquarters type user, perhaps transactions aren't top of mind, therefore aren't on the laundry list of things that you're trying to go get budget approval for in 2022. So thanks everybody for your participation on that one. Let's switch gears a little bit and get down into like a little bit more nitty gritty of the transaction process. So Alex, you mentioned kind of how the company strategy is impacting how you guys analyze local markets, how you plan to grow city by city. Talk about a little more in detail, like what are the critical milestones or the critical data points that you guys are trying to learn as you move through, like, let's just say opening up a new kind of micro fulfillment center in a neighborhood?
Yeah, absolutely. I think generally the demographic information is where we start as a foundational layer. That will give us a lot of clarity around these communities. Before we go into any community with a lease, we're actually doing a significant amount of back-end work to understand who is there as an existing retail player for grocery. I'll keep it kind of specific to that vertical today because we are just doing grocery, but going forward, we'll look at other forms of, goods and retails that we can serve. But in the beginning, it's like, so how is these communities being serviced with grocery today? What is the population density? What is the income in these areas? What types of other corollary brands are there that we see ourselves in as kind of disruptive kind of tech companies? So we look at some trends like that, and that will start to pull a general basis for how I'm going to look at the actual real estate component. And that will put together as almost a list of requirements that I'll go to market with. And I give a broker these 3 requirements, hard requirements, which is, the space. So we've pretty much got it down to a science around how much square foot we need to run an MFC. So the hard requirements are pretty fixed. Soft is, the electrical and HVAC, those types of things. And then the economic requirements, because we're looking at a certain payback period. So with those requirements, I can really go to a broker and say, specifically, all these boxes need to be checked. And this is critically important because I'm seeing such a high volume of deals right now because we need to, continue this growth acceleration. COVID has only been an accelerant for our business in the US, particularly in Europe. So the volume of deals that I need to be seeing on a weekly basis is significantly high. So having a CRM, component as part of the way to manage this pipeline has been incredibly instrumental and just a piece of structure that I've really focused on heavily in my role directly, because at that foundational layer, then we can make better decisions on the transaction once we have, the brokers feeding us information that is precisely what we need and not just what's available. So that's a big piece that we've really stood up and have been pleasantly surprised with how it's allowed us to continue moving very fast.
Are your brokers interacting with that CRM solution? Are you guys collaborating in real time with your teams, or is it still kind of a game of like email and file folders and trying to track down documents?
I don't think we'll get away from email quite yet. I'm working on this extensively, but for now we have let's say a survey capture place where any kind of details around a space before they send it to me via email has to be filled out in this format. And whenever I get this survey response, I know that it's, they've kind of went through all the general checklist, and that survey is connected to two forms, one in Google and one in the CRM tool, which we use to do the underwriting and just the general deal management through stages. So that's been, just applying that simple structure. It took a little bit to get everybody using it, but now that it's up and running, the brokers that we work with most regularly, they do it kind of second, they do it right off the bat now. So it's been just incredible in standardizing our pipeline.
Cool. Dave, you mentioned your portfolio kind of has shifted into more of like several kind of flexible leases versus kind of the, anchor headquarters approach. How has that made your transaction process different? Are you tracking different things? Are you engaging different stakeholders? I imagine you got to stay on top of stuff even more now. Like, are there certain kind of strategies that you've employed to make sure that, that process is airtight?
Yeah, I definitely wouldn't call it airtight. So I think the complexity has risen. So if you think about it in terms of a ratio of like the amount of work relative to the square footage, that ratio has increased because we have expirations coming more quickly. So the level of work relative to the amount of space we occupy has gone up. And so again, the positive side to that is that we have flexibility. We're not locked in long in too many places where we might not want to be. The downside is it creates a lot of churn. We're functionally organized, so we have a transaction team, we have a facilities team, we have a project management team. And so the level of coordination required across those functions is really high to make sure that we size and program correctly. We understand what a landlord's going to provide versus what our own team's going to provide. And so, yeah, it's definitely not airtight. Our technology is really focused on the lease admin side and making sure that we're documenting things appropriately, that we're accounting for things appropriately. And so the requirements from the workplace team are very different than the requirements from the accounting team. So the accounting team is interested more in gap calculations and straight lining of lease, and we're more interested in actually the ability to manage the process and be able to find things easily. And so sometimes those requirements are in conflict, but I think longer term, we're going to need to think about how do we use technology to actually help us with the transaction management process, making sure that we're aligned with external partners, but also our internal partners, making sure that project management and the transaction team are fully aligned prior to signing a deal. And so I think there's still work for us to do to improve upon that.
Yeah, I think your point about internal partners is specifically important because every business unit stakeholder has some kind of need for real estate information, whether it's marketing or sales or IT and infrastructure and facilities. Like, there's going to be data that is derived from your real estate data process that somebody is going to need within the organization. So by providing that access to that source of truth, I think you could break down a lot of barriers and create a lot of efficiencies. Mack, I mean, when we first met, you were like you described, it was like a whack-a-mole approach to like, hey, we got to nibble off a little bit of space here or there because we got to hire 20 engineers in Boston.
Yeah.
You know, we identified some good talent in Las Vegas, so we want to set up a WeWork there and, you know, plant a flag and see if we can grow that office. Is that still true for how you operate with your transaction process, or has it become more complicated or less over time?
Yeah, I would say that our general strategy has remained pretty true in the sense that, going back to what I said before, where we're not going to jump into a market. We've made that mistake in markets before, where we actually did that in San Francisco a few years ago, where there was a founder push to just open up an office there blindly. And we never even made it into the office. We ended up subleasing a sublease before we even moved in because we didn't want to spend the money building it out. So events like that have really tapered our strategy, and we are very careful. We do a lot of short-term stuff. We have really good relationships with WeWork, with Regis. Alex, we actually were working really closely with Notel before, you know, things unfortunately kind of went south, and they were a great partner for us because what I'm trying to provide is a way to deliver space that we can attract talent to, that people want to go to, that can give us a short-term situation and give us flexibility, but also foster growth, because our intent when we're opening an office is not to have 5 people there, right? It's to have 5 to start, and then in a year have it be 150. And so, you know, when you look at Vegas, for example, which has kind of been our most active market other than Boston, that's one where, you know, we started with a Regis space, we moved up to a WeWork space, we moved to a second WeWork space, we acquired a company that also had a WeWork space out there, we combined them into one WeWork, we took over the WeWork building. But the reason we're doing all this is trying to establish some sort of baseline with, to David's point, the other verticals in our business, between finance, between recruiting, between our engineering needs, between our operational needs, to figure out what the actual right size of space is to take. And, you know, COVID obviously throws in a whole other monkey wrench into that equation. But from our perspective, we're trying to manage our strategy in a sense of, if we don't really know the answer, why should we speculate? Let's work with what we know. Let's control what we can control. And if we can do that and create relationships with these providers to actually build in this flexibility, we're probably in a better state at the end of the day. And what that's allowed us to do, like flash forward to today, is, you know, we're building a second headquarters in Las Vegas while also maintaining a great relationship with WeWork. And we've grown enough with them and with our shared space providers to where they know and understand our strategy, which helps us actually work with them and implement it. And then it also allows for a much happier overall group at the end of the day, which is nice.
Yeah, definitely pleasing those internal stakeholders is kind of paramount to success, because, you know, you could go and spend millions of dollars on real estate decisions, but, you know, if one business unit is dissatisfied with it, you know, that it could put a whole like wrench in the whole operation. Let's hit pause again and throw up that second polling question. All right, cool. Well, while that answer tabulates, let's keep going. So we're about a third. Okay, there we go. Interesting. So again, you know, people who are looking to implement a technology probably have a reason for it, right? And that's either volume or just past experience where things may have screwed up along the way, and technology is a way to solve those problems. Alex, you've been kind of more detailed in terms of your tech stack, if you will, and just to kind of define the term tech stack, like what is that kind of layered approach to the technologies that you use in your you know, in your transaction process specifically, but also just throughout the business. We've heard about lease administration and potentially even lease accounting softwares as well. Alex, you've mentioned CRM, so maybe walk us through that tech stack of like, where does data move through, you know, in your real estate process, and is there kind of a closed enough loop where you feel like there isn't any sort of leakage of that data, or you know, stakeholders within or outside of the business that aren't kind of in that tech stack kind of workflow?
100%. I think one of the things I wanted to touch on, which I did in the previous question, was really around the stakeholders involved in my business. I don't want to overlook this because it is incredibly complex. I'm very much at the top of funnel. So the real estate strategy piece is putting the pin in the map. Beyond me, there is supply chain, construction, procurement, operations, and then like our local warehouse teams that end up actually operating in this space. So we have quite a few parties that need to, be in sync when we look at, for example, a new warehouse in Brooklyn. My process has to be so tight because procurement, supply chain, operations are planning to, get goods to this facility, hire people from this community to work in this facility. So if I miss a week, that disrupts everything. And on top of that, we have the challenging piece of marketing. Marketing is incredibly local for us. So when we go to Queens, we're buying television ads in Queens and really being local to this community. And if I miss my date because the real estate deal is slipping, those costs become loss. And that's a big piece for us. So I just wanted to outline that the general process across Gorillas is there's many stakeholders involved. And but to the tech stack piece, I think procedurally that critical piece starts with the data. So right now we have a very rich form of feedback in the form of our customers, right? So when we're able to process those orders that we're seeing through the app, I can directly correlate that against existing locations and project that against future locations. So, for example, New York, we can see how certain growth in a warehouse has been affected by advertising and promotions in these neighborhoods versus other neighborhoods where we didn't do so much of that. And that is really interesting because I come from a world in Notel where, the sales cycle was so long. We were working with people like Mack and David, where to get someone in a space, it was a very long sales cycle, but having this instantaneous feedback of consumers buying groceries, all throughout the day has been incredibly rich in form of informing, our approach to other markets. So that data layer really becomes the foundation for how we make decisions. So we have a performance and planning team, which is very correlated with the real estate function. So I'm looking at, real estate economics, and they're feeding me information from the app in real time. And we're able to look at and try and find patterns ultimately with past performance and hopefully future performance. So that's been critical. And then from that piece, I mentioned the CRM. That is really just a way to organize kind of the old school industry that real estate is. I think we're trying to challenge our brokers to be more tech savvy. And I think the one thing that I'll mention here too about integrating tech into any of these businesses, the tools have become so easy. You just need the stakeholders to buy in and try them. Like the ability to onboard, something like a CRM tool or a portfolio lease management tool. The tools are so streamlined now where the lift operationally is very small. So I think it's really about just building internal momentum within your organization to really focus on this is the future. It will improve productivity across all of these, functions within the business. And it's the optimal way to work going forward. So, I think the lease admin piece really ties in all of these teams together, accounting, real estate, our operations, because we can really see a holistic glance at the whole portfolio. And I think that's been the most exciting piece is the asset management, where we can measure the performance of these fulfillment centers across our network today. So that will be the critical piece that's still kind of yet defined for me is like, how can I keep this streaming view of each individual warehouse and really see which ones are working, which ones are, this calibration layer is the key piece that I'm focused on right now. Cause I think the pipeline, the transaction are pretty in a good place. And now the next piece is asset management piece. So that's what we're working on.
Yeah, it's a lot to work on. Dave, you mentioned lease administration as a tool that is vital to your guys' operation of the portfolio. You also mentioned your accounting team and how they require data for their FASB and IFRS compliance. maybe walk us through your tech stack and started at the kind of inception of a deal, right? Like you guys got to go find a new WeWork, or you're actually going to go build out a real long-term lease. Like how do you, kick off that process, and where does tech
Sure.
come in? And, do the brokers actually get involved with your technology today?
Yeah, so I wouldn't call it a stack yet, at least on the transaction side. I think we wanted to get there. So we have aspirations to build a fully functional technology architecture for all the workplace functions, including technology and lease admin. So for all the reasons mentioned before, real estate data, that could be square footage, that could be cost of occupancy, that could be a ton of different things. That data currently resides on a lot of different places. And so you might get a square footage number from one group that differs from a square footage number from another group. And so we don't lack for tools. So we have a lot of disparate tools that are not well integrated at this point. So we have a construction management tool for the construction team. We have a lease admin tool for the transaction team. We use a work order tool that some of the other parts of the company use. And so we have a number of different tools. And one of the biggest challenges for us implementing anything at a tech company tends to be the privacy and data security aspect. And so unlike other places I've worked, it's not very difficult to convince people that you need a tool, because we're a tech company. There's a real openness to trying things and implementing things. Other places I've worked at, it's like, well, why do we need that? Why do we need this kind of software? That's not an issue for us. The issue often is like, how many other tools is it going to touch? Is it going to touch some of our core systems? And so that process can be one of the biggest challenges. Is it going to touch the HRIS? Is it going to touch our ERP? Those are really the areas where things sort of get bogged down. But hopefully in 12 to 18 months, if we talk again, we'll have a much clearer picture of what that architecture looks like. We'll have single source of truth as it relates to core real estate data that then resides in some sort of data warehouse, data lake, and feeds all the other systems we use, because our approach is really a best in breed point solution approach. We're not going to implement some sort of IWMS that tries to solve for everything. That's a decision we've made. So hopefully, again, if we talk in a year and a half, we'll have made some of those connections. I'll be able to talk about it in terms of an actual stack and what that looks like, but we're still on that journey.
Yeah, I think the point of disparate data is kind of the crux of it. And the InfoSec, the security piece of it is interesting, because I can speak to that from a vendor's perspective. The rigor through which prospects and customers put us now when they're evaluating us as a vendor is just, it's kind of mind numbing how many questions you just have to answer that are solving for those kind of data security points that you brought up, Dave, because it's almost like, to Alex's point, that the solutions themselves today are pretty out of the box, right? It doesn't take months to deploy a lease administration tool anymore. But, when there's critical business information, personal identifiable information, and regulations that span geographies that need to be considered, when thinking about how a vendor processes your data, those are things that start to become way more important in the procurement process. So I could definitely attest to having to fill out a lot of those InfoSec forms. Mack, walk us through your tech stack if you have one. If it's analogous to Dave's, maybe there's disparate solutions. Maybe you got a single source. Do you have an IWMS? Like, how does DraftKings do it?
Yeah, I guess like a lot of the stuff that Dave mentioned is very hits home for me. We have to deal with pretty much the same thing. For us, it's actually taken to another level too, because at DraftKings, not only are we a tech company with all this critical data, but we're also essentially a bank. We take credit card information, it's PII information. And so because of that, that puts on a whole other layer to basically vetting any vendor. In fact, actually, we were in our little meeting room before this panel started, and I was taking this 20 minutes to literally complete my annual vendor onboarding training, right? So there's things that we have to do and hoops that we have to jump through, but there's no way around that. That's just kind of the trade-off, if you will, to where David and we have to navigate through a very hectic and crazy network of, company restrictions to protect our customers. Alex's, I think, technology struggle is more on the actual, get the correct facility up, put in the right place, and actually optimize how they can get groceries to people, right? So it's two totally different things. But, I think like from a technology standpoint and how we like optimize that process, it doesn't exist yet. Like I wish we had a better solution for it. But to everyone's point, it's like what we're implementing is not rocket science. It's just that we are taking every single little precaution to make sure everyone's protected. And if this is going to have does this need to be integrated into Workday? Does this need to have an actual ticket system in our Just Ask? Like there's a lot of different layers to it. And that's, I think, just part of the job that we take on when you're frankly running, as I say, quote unquote, real estate at a tech company.
Yeah. Awesome points all around. I don't know if there will ever be that holy grail of that one single solution. I think,
right.
The original approach of the IWMS solutions is to be kind of that magic bullet that solves every process and problem within the facilities and workplace org. But
right.
I think the world has shifted pretty obviously towards point solutions. And if you could mesh those together and create that data lake or that data warehouse that Dave mentioned, that different stakeholders can pull information from and have access to what they need when they need it. That seems to be kind of the agile approach that most businesses are moving towards.
Yeah, and I guess just to follow up on that, Matt, and once again, I know we're not supposed to be plugging things, but like that is why, like for me, and I mean, me, everyone else here doesn't, but I'm like a very solution-oriented person. I want to get things done basically as fast and efficiently as I can and do the right thing. When we're looking at how we operate our space and how we expand, like technology is great when it helps, right? But at the same time, I don't need a solution for a problem I'm not trying to fix. And I think that's like a key to all of this, where if I can get some basically lease administration software that does help me organize, but to your point, actually enables me to then give other people, my finance team, my legal team, access to all of our leases, access to all of our budgets, access to our operating plans, that's what makes a difference for me and actually improves my day-to-day.
Yep. Cool. Well, we're coming up on 15 minutes left here. Let's pop up that third polling question, which I think is going to be very kind of topical to what we're talking about here on this last question. What do you see as the main obstacles for successful transaction management technology rollout? And Alex alluded to adoption. Tenant reps is one area of adoption. Mack alluded to kind of customization to the workflow. Is that a high priority, or are there other problems that are trying to be solved from an adoption perspective? Last call here also for any questions from our audience. We've got one here in the chat that I can kind of start talking about while we get those final polling results up. Daniel has asked, are there any tech solutions being used to filter / process employee survey data and occupancy patterns? Anybody want to jump on that one?
So I'm not sure I fully understand the question and the linkage between occupancy and survey data. What I think it's tying employee sentiment to actual location was what I'm taking away from that. And so we started using a tool. I think it's actually a Workday product. It's called Peakon. So I think Workday acquired it. And so that's our Pulse survey platform. And so how it actually connects occupancy to the survey data, I'm not sure. But the level of detail and analysis it provides leaders throughout the company is much better than I've seen from other tools. So I'm not trying to plug the product. I have no skin in the game. But typically with employee pulse surveys, what you see is you get this huge data dump, and you get some scores like percentages, engagement, et cetera, and maybe 1,000 comments, and it's really difficult to actually sort through and figure out what to do with it. And so with this particular tool, and again, there may be others out there on the market that I'm not familiar with, it actually does a lot of the analytics for you and points you in directions. Says, hey, you should probably take a look at this. Looks like this is a little lower than it should be. Does a lot of benchmarking within your own company, within external companies, so you can see where the flashpoints are. So again, not a plug, just something I've seen firsthand. And how we actually tie it to location from a workplace perspective, I'm not sure yet, but it's actually something we've been thinking about. It's like, okay, we must influence employee engagement to some extent with the offices and amenities we provide. How direct that is, what that correlation is, I'm not totally sure. But there must be a level of influence that our team has, and we would want to understand that.
Cool. So we got our answers here on the survey here. Adoption by internal stakeholders seems to be the biggest area of impediment that people foresee when adopting technology. So, you know, that maybe that's different in the type of business, as Dave mentioned earlier. They're a tech company, so they're much more open to trying tech solutions as an approach. But thanks everybody for participating in that. We got another question here from Brian Lee. How do you manage and determine KPIs for productivity differences between in-office versus mobile workforce? In other words, how do you spy on your people? Who wants to take that one?
Well,
Alex,
I'll say Pinterest would never spy on its employees. I'll say that. We take that very seriously, and there's certainly legal requirements in different parts of the world. But there, and so spying is probably a nasty term to use. But there are actually a number of tools out there that I've seen on the market, and I'm not, again, plugging them, advocating for them. But there are tools that actually consume metadata across email, calendar, and other systems, and try to give you some sense of, it's really not about like productivity, like, hey, I'd like to make sure that my employees are giving max effort, but really, where is the organization healthy? Are there areas that are functioning well or less well? And so there are a number of companies out there. I think it's a pretty new space. I think the bar to get those tools implemented in any company are pretty high, just because of the level of big brother aspect to it. And so, I don't know how successful those firms have been in terms of acquiring customers, because again, it's a big ask. Like, hey, we're gonna look at all your emails, but promise not to read the content. We're just gonna look at the timestamp and what department it went from. So, but there are tech platforms out there that are doing that, and so anyway, that's my knowledge of it.
Yeah, Matt, you mind if I jump in there for a sec?
I do not.
I think that it's both things, David, and also what you mentioned earlier about how you're actually looking and gauging the survey results and everything. So at DraftKings, so I report to our chief people officer. We found and I've done that the whole time. I get my approvals obviously from our CFO and work directly with that, but my work is so much more of, as we said, a service org to the people. And something that our org has built out over the last, I think, 3 years is an actual full people analytics team. So we have, I think, like a 7-person people analytics team now that really is just focused on pretty much everything you just said, because like if we said that we're going to monitor your emails and all that stuff, like people would just quit, right? I think the only thing that would make people quit faster at DraftKings if we started like, I don't know, drug testing for weed. So, it's really just something that like we wouldn't even consider. And I think everyone kind of in the like tech world would agree with that, because if someone was like, I'm going to start monitoring you and spying on you, whatever, they're just going to go somewhere else. However, what we do are 2 things. One, for our more service organization, right, that's ticket based, that is tracked, right? And there is a standard that operation associates are they're held to, and they need to hit those ticket numbers and complete them on time, et cetera, right? That's much more straightforward and easy to manage. To get through the more gray area of how people are feeling, what they want, and all that stuff, that's where we actually utilize poly surveys via Slack. And we have a people analytics team that they're not just asking, I guess, the most straightforward questions, right? They're trying to really come up with hypotheses, actually figure out like what's driving employees, where productivity is, because at the end of the day, we can derive whatever we want, but if the people are happy, then they're going to be successful. And if they're not, they're going to complain, and it's going to cause organizational distress. So that's really it, right? And it is always whack-a-mole. It's never a straightforward solution, but this at least allows us to keep a tab on it. And it's quarterly people survey, and then really putting in that time and effort to really digest that info and come up with some key deliverables from it. And it's not easy, and it does take a lot of time.
Cool. I think we got time for one more question, and we do have one, and I think it's a good segue question here. How do you foresee, this is from Morgan, how do you foresee the future of the office and or the tenant experience playing out for your respective organizations?
I'll go. So, for DraftKings, it's still up in the air. But what the general consensus is that we do want people back in the office to some extent. What we will definitely not be doing is forcing people back 5 days a week. However, we've definitely realized the importance of the collaboration. It's just kind of needed to some extent. And so what we've done is basically started to bucket employees into 3 categories. There's fully remote, where there are exceptions. There are some people who have been hired as remote jobs, whatever the case may be. There is then the middle bucket, which is 2 to 3 days a week in the office. And then there's the far end of the spectrum, which is full-time in the office, which is somewhat voluntary, but more for some of the teams like SecOps, IT, some of workplace experience that are expected to be in each day. But from there, we want to make sure that we are providing the option to go in, but not forcing somebody's hand, because we have no data to suggest that we need to do that, right? That's what it comes down to. If we were forcing people back in 5 days a week, candidly, I think that would come from a selfish point of our founders of saying, I don't know what's going on. I don't trust what's happening. I want everybody back so I can keep an eye on them. And if I was running my business, maybe I would feel differently about that. But as an employee of this business, I feel like I've been able to keep my productivity at a higher level than ever by working from home. I miss the collaboration coming into the office and being with people a couple of days a week. And that's how I'm going to personally approach it. And that's how, if we look at our data, that's how 85% of our population feels at this point, at least in North America. EMEA is a little different. There's more of a desire, I'd say, to be in the office, but general sense is still pretty much the same.
Yeah, and I think similar to Mack, my position as a workplace leader is I'm agnostic in terms of, like, yes, I would love people to be in the office. I think it's good for my career if the offices have more importance, but I'm not here to try to tell people you should work here or there. We're competing with people's living rooms and people's home offices. And so we need to give them reasons to come in. And so this is really my own editorial, because I don't know what it's going to look like for sure. But what I think is going to happen is the office will become a destination where people come to periodically. It's not going to be your place of work necessarily. It'll be a destination. So it'll need to support events. It'll need to support team gatherings. It'll need to provide a lot more optionality in terms of different places to work and convene throughout the day. So I think the purpose of the office, again, this is my own editorial, and we're not making these huge speculative investments, remodeling everything. But I think we'll see it become more of an event hub, and these places where people intentionally come to convene for specific events or specific meetings. There may be people who do choose to work in the office on a regular basis for whatever reason. Maybe it's easier to work there than from their home, but that's where I see it's going. Again, we're not going to go out and remodel everything and do that before we see people come back. But I think the office is going to have a different purpose for us. In fact, I know it is going forward, and it'll be interesting to see how that plays out.
Agreed.
Awesome.
I can add a few words too, just from, I guess, the contrarian point of view for us. Like, well, we need to be close to these MFCs. We need to be in the city and locally understanding, where things are going wrong. So I think an element of how we've done that to date, in New York, we've actually secured a long-term lease at this office, which is directly above our warehouse below. So that's been an incredibly rich environment just to, monitor the growth of this facility in general. But I don't think that's the solution across the whole country. What we'll probably do, and what we did previously, was utilize something like a co-working space, WeWork, Industrious, to have that professional space where people can come together in those markets. But we're still kind of figuring out if we need to have a particular fixed HQ per each region that we're in. I think ultimately it's no, because WeWork and Industrious have built such a great infrastructure that we could take advantage of that. But ultimately, we will have core people in office in some sort of a professional space.
Yeah, I mean, as a kind of a fast-growing startup, we're in the process of polling our employees about what is their ideal work-life situation. Because I think one thing that's interesting is the barriers to hiring have come down geographically. Mack is right that the grab for talent is insanely competitive, but one advantage I think that companies have today is that you no longer have to tie a new hire to a physical location. So knowing what the standard or kind of array of work situations exist out there, you can now supply that to an employee, right? So like we have an office here in Boston, we have one in New York City, but everybody else is remote. And they all have their own personal preferences and life situations that dictate how they want to work. So I agree with all of you guys. I don't think it's figured out yet, but I do think there's going to be a unique approach that every company needs to take. So yeah,
there's also, just for the group, there's a good article, I think it came out today in the Harvard Business Review, just talking about why companies are not cutting back on office space, and pretty much talking about everything we just said, where, the working style is changing. The amount of days in the office is definitely going to be changing, but how does that actually affect the space? That's where it becomes the question, right? And then it becomes towards the use. But good article for people on the panel to take a look at.
Yeah, and just one interesting statistic from our platform, and we provide lease administration, transaction management, lease accounting software, and essentially we gather all of our customers' leases into one place, and we look at the data that's being ingested into our system from time to time, and we saw over 2021 for office occupiers alone a 38% uptick in physical locations across all the portfolios that are in our system. So I think that kind of plays pretty well with what Dave was saying, is like fewer more smaller offices and fewer head offices. So I think that trend is just going to continue even further until we get out of this mess. We'll see what happens. But I'm going to stop it here, guys. We got a minute left. Carlos, do you have any final thoughts, announcements you want to share with anybody? But thanks so much to Alex, Dave, and Mack for your awesome insights, your participation in the panel. Thanks to the Corenet New York City chapter for hosting. Carlos, why don't you take us home here?
Yeah, nothing else from me. Thank you, Matt, for leading this conversation, and thanks to all the speakers and everyone in the audience for joining today. Hope to see you again soon. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. Take care.